Hey everybody. I'm thinking about you. When I begin to make these videos or speak, explore something, somehow those of you who find yourselves inclined to watch the video or listen and hopefully participate in your imagination, as I do even when I'm making something, then kind of magic happens where our minds and spirits come together in a place that can be dismissed with language but cannot be encompassed by it. In a way, in ways, many ways, that have that same quality. They can be dismissed with language, but they cannot be encompassed by it. Which means, in our language, English, it's extremely difficult to point meaningfully at this place we come together. But in making these videos and in some way with those who observe them sincerely, we're sharing soul time. We're inviting each other in ways that are different from me making a video and someone listening. But we're inviting each other into communion, into a kind of intimacy, into a between of relation. And that's a deeply profound way of relating. Even though it's mediated by the electronics, which is a really strange thing to put into that mix, I have to say. It's a very troubling thing to put in the between of us, these machines. To put tools in there. In the living between of all beings, to put machines. And in the living between of our relationships, for there to be machines. And I can hear objections, even in my own mind, right? But still, fundamentally, I think this is a very dangerous and tragic thing to do. We human beings tend to synchronize to the betweens of relationships and habits and activities and tasks and frameworks and routines and expectations, and against them too, but we synchronize both ways, right? For and against. That's a lot of synchronization work in a world full of meaningless objects and machines. We acquire our senses of meaning and value, identity, potential, relation, primarily from our contexts, unless we're quite good at inventing sort of creatively, playfully, moment to moment, what these values become for us, rather than collapsing to the well-exchanged norms of identity, meaning, value, relationship, commerce, so on. Some of us manage to preserve a field of play above those highly collapsed, highly structured, mechanical subpositions. But it's a grim omen in my latter life to observe machines swarming into the between of us, with purposes and driven by frameworks that are malignant, omnicidal, self-terminating, really, really dangerous and wrong in a very fundamental way, right? This is wrong. The same way the deer knows that the car that crushes it is wrong. That kind of wrong. Because you see, there never was an animal in nature that acted like a machine until our people became makers of objects and tools and war and killing. And sure, housing and writing and music and dance. And maybe some branches of science still have light in there. But then, and from there on, in a world that had never known cages, cages were everywhere. And then they infected our minds, because our minds become like the tools and weapons and computers and apps we employ. Our minds train toward those very low targets, those cruelly impoverished targets, pre-impoverished, right? And we moved from nature in our bodies and from relating with nature as our minds into little boxes and skeletons and dissections, discriminations, distinguishings, extinguishings. And this blinded us, our people, to the degree wherever it happened, and there are places where it doesn't, that we called this progress. And thought of it as advancement. And it's not untrue that in certain vectors of perspective, It's easy to understand that I'm holding as much computing power in my hand as my nation had in 1950 or 30, you know, pick your year. But what do we make of them, and what are we becoming? In the shadow of the tools that divide us, surveil us, observe us, analyze us, but not for us. For organs of institutions like governments and corporations and societal frameworks where advertising the goal of acquiring our attention to sell us products collapsed our experience of privacy into a seething array of layered nightmares. So that whole machine in the middle thing, I think we should be extremely suspicious about that until and unless we see clear evidence that our people or a group of our people have discovered ways to promote deep awareness of the dangers and careful and intelligent development of the potentials, driven not by surveillance or the desire to sell us something or the fact that our attention equals money for someone, not us. Driven by purposes that are noble and whose effects are medicinal, at the very least. Until then, machines don't belong between us, and perhaps they never will. But we can recognize their sudden, momentous intrusion into the between of us, our own bodies, the rhythms of our bodies, our sleep, our dreaming. We can recognize that as a symptom and a signal, something we should pay very careful attention to without being terrified, so that we can understand the process, its origins, how it came to be. Not perfectly, but in a way that improves as we continue to explore the question. Not looking for the answer, working to understand the field from which the humans, over the course of the evolution of what we refer to as consciousness, and that's a story of biblical proportion, to be sure, and we're still enmeshed in that developmental path, even though I'd argue we're taking really severe damage from machine exposure in our current phase of the development of consciousness. From the time when our species, when our people became capable of building structure, and thus, and that's not the only causal aspect, having our interiority collapse in a similar way, so that we defected from nature in our souls and in our minds, while we defected from nature in our bodies into cages where there's mostly dead space and not much moves except on screens. And tragically, cages are where minds go to die. Which isn't to say there are no minds that can prosper in such cages, but rather, we're very vulnerable to a kind of relational hypoxia, right? Where the dimensions of relation disappear into representations that no longer feed us. And are actually the artifacted remains of having skipped over intimacy, presence, relation. Sometimes because we were frightened, sometimes because we are lonely. There's a terrifying plague of loneliness in a world where everyone can communicate through machines pretty much, if they want to. It's as if that invented new forms of loneliness, right? That were obscured by the seemingly concrete fact of the Facebook news feed, the Twitter feed, Instagram, Pinterest, so on. News. I suspect that though some of us are getting a taste of it, the vast majority of people are starving to death for anything resembling a significant moment of deep, authentic relation. Sometimes when I'm making the videos, I really just want to listen and stop speaking. And in fact, when I'm listening in my heart, in my soul, in my body, with my ears, it seems ridiculous to start making face noises at all. I was having a conversation the other day with a young woman who struggled with bulimia and anorexia. And we were talking about anger and loneliness, isolation, pain. And she spoke of something very familiar to me, which is just that hypoxic impoverishment of meaningful role and relation and identity and activity and adventure, but really just of deep, loving relation with a few other human beings, right? And that really resonated with me. And I said, it's almost as if it's insulting to eat physical food in a context where the fundamentally nourishing necessities of our human existence, deep, heartful, meaningful, playful relation, meaningful roles, adventures, meaningful activity together, all of that's denied, And we get what? The physical thing? The piece of chicken? The cheese? The salad? We get the token. So we're going to be starved in all the ways that actually matter, but we'll get the physical thing and eat that. And it can be viewed as an incredible cruelty, right? And so, you know, if I throw up the food, then people see that something is fundamentally fucked about what's going on, or what's not going on in all the domains where it deeply, profoundly matters, and we're starving for these things. But we keep getting the physical food instead, as if we're going to have to keep doing this work of eating it so that all those other things will keep not happening forever, in worse and worse ways over time. And I'm not laughing. There's nothing humorous about this, except that there's a peculiar aspect of insight required for us to achieve a perspective like that above the terrain in which we're normally really enmeshed and to some degree blinded by. But she and I together kind of naturally are able to form a meaningful exploratory between and try to understand our own pain, our own situation, our own confusion, our own loneliness, our own sadness. And every once in a while we succeed. And I think there's something to this thing I'm pointing at here, where having largely, each of us uniquely, and some of us not as much as others, and some of us catastrophically more than others, having all been denied the fundamentally most nourishing and necessary aspects of our human lives, without which our days become meaningless drudgery and horrible isolation. I mean, just let's get one thing straight, right? One of the main things most modern nations do to punish criminals is isolate them. And if you're really bad, you get completely isolated. And so, the sort of soft, vulnerable human being in all of us is wondering, why am I so bad that I have to be isolated all the time? And they keep pretending to connect people to me or things to me, but it's mostly just to sell me shit or direct my attention to something they get money from, right? That's a really cruel, inhuman library of punishments. So intrinsically, many of us begin to feel, I must be truly bad. No one wants to relate. No one's relating with me. There's no opportunities for relation. The jobs are just grueling slave tasks. And the weekends are filled either with, you know, some kind of hypernormal replacement, video games or drugs or porn or fucking driving sports cars or whatever, you know, whatever non-nourishing thing somehow manages to attract what's sort of injured remains of our attentional faculties. We have the capacity to have some effect on whether our lives are abundant or impoverished, but the contexts we live in really keep doubling down on isolation. And part of that is because it's incentivized. The more isolated we become, the more malnourished in new dimensions of our humanity that had yet been unfracked by capitalism and whatever kind of nonsense you would want to call the swarming massive institutions that prevail over our lives at present. Yes, we have free will, but we're also human and social. And so if the social field of the between is desynchronizing and incoherent, injecting incoherence into our lives and relationships, what happens is that's incentivized, because the hungrier we get, the more broken we are inside, the more we want to buy something, right? Oh, the cocaine will fix this, or the tequila, or the tobacco, or the 17 cupcakes, or, you know, the sports car, the new job, the new lover, the new book, the new bed. Get something, right? Again, you know, you get the physical thing, just like in my example, right? You get some physical object that represents a bunch of really weird things if you think about it. Like, what does a microwave oven represent in terms of relationships? Well, a bunch of environmental omnicide, a bunch of torture in factories, a bunch of banking, right? It's like, if we were metaphysically minded, I don't think we'd let most of the objects that are in our lives anywhere near our lives because they would appear from that perspective to be mostly necessarily evil, right? They're made of bad things, bad relationships, for bad purposes, and they're sold to us after having been disabled, or, you know, having had huge aspects of our humanity castrated during childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and middle age and older age. It just keeps going on. But there's money in that, because if you keep taking something away from our interior, right, we get hungrier and hungrier for things we can try to replace that with, objects. For example, physical food. But something inside us recognizes this atrocity, and it gets very angry and hurt and frightened, because now we're living in a world where I have to not eat food or throw it up in order to demonstrate to the commons, right, the between of us, that something's horribly wrong and nobody's paying any attention, and actually they're pretending it's wrong with me and that I'm broken. And so in a way, you can see a kind of, from one angle, right, you can see a kind of messianic heroism to someone in this condition who is anorexic or bulimic in some way that resonates with what I'm talking about. They're desperately trying to show everyone that we're all starving to death in all the places that aren't physical food, but we've got a whole bunch of physical food. So let's party. But the physical food doesn't replace the other kinds. In fact, not only does it not replace them, it easily exacerbates, magnifies what we're losing, because we can substitute the physical food for the awareness of what's missing, which otherwise I think would be extremely difficult. In other words, were we having to struggle to get food, it'd be much harder to hide the fact of the 60 impoverishments to our lives and humanity and society and interiority. Machines in the between of us. It'd be harder to hide that stuff, right, if we were physically starving too. But if we can eat food as a representation, we can, by defecting from that awareness, we can partially, very crudely or clumsily, cover it over, right? Hide it, hide from it. Except some of us can't. It's the evening. Crow. Sunset. Community. Convocation of crows. It's a good word. When the between of us is incoherent and filled with noise, malware, deceptive signal, intentionally deceptive signals, attempts at mind control, some of which, you know, are relatively simple to succeed with, then where will we reset the inner compass? We use each other to feel and think and know with. We're social animals in this way. This idea that there's an individual is actually kind of silly, because it's sort of a fiction of language. There aren't any individuals without other people. There's no language, no use for it, no knowledge, no use for it. All the things we think of as being individual come not merely from our relationships with culture and society and language and knowledge and concepts, habits, overlays, frameworks, functions. So whether we resist or we run to, into the cages, the frameworks, the representations, we're still, it doesn't, the entire context is very momentously charging in the direction of exchanging tokens for relationships. I mean, money is the simplest example of that. And inventing new ways to do that faster and faster over time, accelerating that process. So that just makes us hungrier, trains us to be better consumers. But it's incredibly confusing because ordinarily, whether or not we like to admit it, no matter how we frame it in language, we depend on each other to make sense together, right? And so, if the opposite of that is happening, now we have the capacity to truly become individuals. Now we can be cut off from that rich between of being and concern, humanity, love, wonder, reverence. Now we can be cut off from that. And the more cut off we become from that, the hungrier for things we get. The more we want to defend the remains. In hope that maybe for a moment something beautiful or meaningful might yet come to be, or we might yet catalyze it, or just as people stay up very late at night because their days are so desolate of meaning and relation that they don't want to go to sleep yet because they're hoping, well, maybe in the nighttime when all of that framing stuff dies down, maybe then some beautiful thing could come to be, or we could, someone will call, or I can maybe call someone, or something can happen. So they just stay up, hoping that something happens. And most of the time, if it's, for example, if I'm talking about myself, I'm just doing something actually inane. Writing something, scrolling through some garbage on the internet, playing a video game, watching a movie, whatever, eating some kind of nasty food. So yeah, that day never comes most of the time. Before I began to speak, I was thinking about vigilance and hypervigilance, and how vigilance used to lead us into intimacy with our cohorts, right? When we had cohorts, vigilance was rewarded and sort of a sign of sensing with and for one's intimate cohort, but not just them. But vigilance is really dangerous in a situation where we're constantly driven to be vigilant so that we become multi-vigilant, hyper-vigilant, and that makes us really unresilient. It's a really serious danger. There's still some kinds of vigilance that pay off, but most of the self-generating, recursive aspects of vigilance that lead to hypervigilance and multi-vigilance, those are symptoms of the breakdown of the between, right? Now we can't depend on anyone else to help us. It's like a school of individual fish, right? Where they don't move together. And they respond as individuals to a threat rather than a group, right? Which loses them, 3/4 of their innate responsiveness first move. Those group movements are protective, right? Flocks of birds, wheels of pigeons, murmurations of blackbirds, schools of fish. You see in these examples a swarm of animals becoming a super animal, a meta animal, beyond mere individual animals. And humans are made for this. We do it, however, in dimensions that have mostly been kidnapped. And we've been conscripted primarily to meaningless roles in the void and chaos that ensues when all of our interiority is invaded and represented and evaluated for value and judged and dismissed and amputated and, you know, denigrated. If you're a child and they cut part of you off, the first thing you'll hear is, well, it never wasn't there in the first place. Right? And this is the resounding rebuff from modern society toward most of what's meaningful about being human. Oh, that's just a bunch of fantasy noise. Yeah, in a world of swarming representations where there's not enough space or silence for it to even begin to emerge, that looks like a true statement. But when we make the space and the intention together and invite our potentials into emergence together, sincerely, earnestly, reverently, we will find out whether that's just a bunch of fantasy bullshit or not. In the same way, lightning or earthquakes or volcanoes teach humans whether their representational frameworks are a bunch of fantasy bullshit or not. The other night in the lightning storm, I realized this just how incredibly vulnerable to total decimation the frameworks and languages and histories and knowledge, but particularly the physical stuff we've made, is to just being completely obliterated by nature. If she but gently move her pinky, all that we have done is gone. And maybe us, right? I think our capacity to build things like this is very deceiving about where the precedence of power lies with us and our machines, or in the before of their origins, or even their origins. Something will pierce the charade. Whether in my lifetime or not, and in what ways, I can't say, but the game being played on the broad scale by humans those games are nearly all really bizarre delusional results of having fallen down the ladder of origin and relation and the between of us into structure and representations, products, processes. And that will not fly much longer. But it needn't fly in our own lives, because we, being aware of this, will have the, our opportunity to move out of it into true and meaningful roles and relations, even in a context that gravely inhibits that. Our capacity, our opportunity to do that expands. And in the waterfall of crises, that are happening now and are to come, more and more aspects of the delusional charades of atrocity and omnicide that our cultures actually represent. They don't merely represent it, they are the engines of its accomplishment. More and more of those layers will become visible even to common people. I'm not sure how helpful that will be. However, perhaps we may tend to fall away from away from representation toward relation in catastrophes. There's some evidence of this historically. It's not the only thing that's going to happen. Hi. When we're highly vigilant, we're not especially smart. It takes a lot of energy, and it probably produces some metabolic problems over long term because it's meant to be a short-term, high-intensity thing. So, but in isolation, vigilance becomes a constant because we can no longer depend on the field of minds and souls and lineages and bodies of our cohort with whom we would otherwise deeply belong, meaningfully belong, right? We're no longer making sense with them, and they're not making sense with us. So in isolation, we lose 3/4 of the sensory domains we might otherwise naturally feel and need, and is part of that underlying nourishment, right, that I'm saying keeps getting hijacked and kidnapped and sold back to us as representations, right? Tokens, objects, bullshit. We can't recreate the field on our own, no matter how intelligent or insightful we are. Though there's a scope of concern in which an individual can make sense by themselves, right? There's a scope of concern there. I can make sense just walking up this path, for example, in the sense that I don't stumble over my own foot right now. But in general, intelligence doesn't lie in individuals. And we have this myth that individuals are containers for qualities. That's not what's going on, I'm telling you. They might be localizations of qualities, but that's different from a container. And when I say localization, I mean they're a unique participant in the field of the evolution of consciousness, knowledge, language, culture, science, ideas, perspectives, insights. They're a unique point of presence for that field. But if that field becomes incoherent, it's extremely difficult for the local single individual to be making sense, because they use the field to make sense with. So we inherit decoherence from the relational between when relationships are replaced with representations of what might have been, what otherwise might have been. And in that situation, we're prone to become hypervigilant. All kinds of other problems ensue. I'm carrying wounds, I'm a human, I'm an ego, I have insecurity, doubt, shame. I'm going to not be terribly likely to look inward at that myself, but I'll project it outward onto the world around me and then react against what's actually in myself as if it were in the world primarily, which doesn't entirely mean it isn't. It's just that the fact that it's in the world isn't really the charged aspect of that behavior. Yeah. So when we're alone, vigilance can break us down very quickly. Even, and I'm not just meaning mentally, like metabolically. We're not made for high vigilance over long periods. That's why sports games don't go on for 12 hours. Although, you know, there are domains where humans test vigilance over long periods of time. And again, that our experience of having to be hypervigilant because we're alone, or we're on our own, or I'm the only one who can actually affect my life ideas, the only one, really, that turns into like a metabolic toxic cocktail. And that makes us again hungry for products, right? Now again, we want something to represent to us not having felt serenity, not having felt calm, not feeling safe enough to be present, not feeling safe enough to play and learn and grow, because the incredible prevalence of machines and frameworks, incoherence, decoherence, desynchronization, Zeitstorer, time breaking, in our experience is eating up the space in which we might otherwise have new faculties, new senses, new opportunities, creativity, play, joy, wonder. The stuff that actually makes for a meaningful moment, a meaningful life in our experience. Of course, some will argue, no, it's liberation from all of that desire. True enough. But we don't usually start there. We kind of start in kindergarten of, you know, and not all of us are inclined to be mindfulness practitioners and to succeed along that path. And even the mindfulness practitioners will admit, oh no, there's deep meaning in relation, right? I think. In true relation and active sensing and play and wonder. I don't think they'd throw all that away and just say, a bunch of samsara. I hope not. I'd be a pretty grouchy mindfulness person. When our cohorts are coherent, even if they're small, that is profoundly medicinal and calming, because we're distributing the sense making among us, so the whole weight of trying to make sense of the entire universe doesn't land on one human being's back anymore. And we not only help each other to make sense when the cohort has integrity, we reward each other, we nourish each other. Like, if we were looking at this from an economic standpoint, there's no possible way we'd ever pick game A, what everyone's doing in general. We'd never pick that. We'd always pick a trusted cohort of people we love, that love us, that we can develop explosively together and beautifully and playfully and help each other and take a little bit of the burden where someone's got too much and guide each other and learn to see together, because I'd much rather have these 5 fingers than this one. And I'd much rather have this one than a representation of it, because that's not actually a sense, right? This is a real sense. No, I mean, the amount of work we have to do to defect from meaningful relation with nature and other human beings, the amount of work we have to do if we're going to defect from that, it just gets mountainous, and there keeps being new domains in which we have to do more work over time. That game kills everything. That game does not work. And it's a game modeled after a gross misapprehension of evolutionary theory that we could call social Darwinism. But social Darwinism isn't from evolution, it's from humans doing stupid things harder and harder in more new ways per moment. And then claiming, well, we're just modeling it on nature. No, that's not. There's nothing like that in nature anywhere except us. So it's imperative that we learn together, help each other, even if only for an hour. We don't have to succeed on a broad scale. We don't have to transform the world overnight. Hey, it would be great if we could. But we can do little experiments, right? In cohort building and, you know, finding a direction together and learning how to be together in a tightly knit group that's with and for each other all the time. And if things break down, that's the direction humans are going to naturally travel in, because that's our nature to do that. Same way dolphins and whales and fish make schools, and, you know, we are social creatures. And that's been co-opted, killed off, sold back to us in millions of new forms, you know, whatever. But that's our nature, and that's why we're vulnerable to that gambit. We need each other, fundamentally, all the time. And, you know, again, I'm speaking in overarching generalities, which isn't a form I'm fond of. But I'm trying to point at something that's very general. There's all kinds of unique exceptions in the field. And yes, I'm looking mostly at the people who are the median or the average, the sort of most common denominator. And a lot of what we see in there is people who are either badly injured or they just fell off a cliff of not trying. So that's not a good indicator of what it means to be human. That's sort of the the little pool in that layer of hell, right, that contains the most people. There are many of us who struggle and sometimes succeed to remember, to discover, and to reorient ourselves to whatever degree we may be able, however small that degree may seem. And to be very clear, though I can see all of these things, I am capable of seeing them. Being them is vastly more challenging in a context where there's no generator for cohorts that are meaningful, right? You can't sign up for one of those. Or if you can, I mean, it may be pre-corrupted. But there are very few generators for meaningful cohorts. And one of them is a really passionately held mutual purpose. And this is part of why you can get meaningful cohorts. For example, it's going to sound weird, but a tightly knit terrorist group can be a very intensely meaningful cohort. They're going to put their lives on the line for something they've all agreed. And this presumes they weren't brainwashed entirely, which maybe most of them are. But similarly, you know, a 9-man special ops group, that's a really intimate cohort. I'm using examples from war because they're the low-hanging fruit, right? They're right in front of my face. So yeah, there are very few cohort generators, and part of the reason it's attractive for young men, when it is, to go to war is they know about this cohort thing, and they've had it in childhood maybe, or a semblance of it, and they want more. Humans are extremely highly motivated when they're a part of a deeply shared relational between of intimacy. Yeah. And one of the primary arbiters of that type of relation is importance, right? That something is truly, profoundly important, so that our purpose is to approach and relate with something deeply and profoundly important together. That's a relatively near at hand catalyst for relational intensity and depth. The sun and the moon never look the same in the camera as they do to my eye. I'm grateful even for this electronically mediated between of us. I'm thankful to anyone who's motivated to watch my videos. Hope that you may find something interesting or useful in there. And feel free to post questions or comments. Or if it's really important, get in touch. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye for now.